Piano teachers see children at their most vulnerable, struggling with difficult pieces, frustrated by mistakes, celebrating small victories when they finally master a challenging song. She'd learned to read more than just musical notes in her students' faces. But when 7-year-old Emma started flinching at unexpected sounds and covering bruises with long sleeves, the signals had nothing to do with stage fright. Welcome to Silent Heroes. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden protection and courage in unexpected places, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Margaret Chen had been teaching piano to children in her home studio for 12 years, nurturing young musicians through their first hesitant scales to confident performances that filled parents with pride. Her converted garage studio was equipped with 2 baby grand pianos, comfortable seating for parents who preferred to observe lessons, and walls decorated with certificates from student competitions and recitals that celebrated years of musical achievement. At 54, Margaret had built a reputation as the most patient and encouraging piano instructor in suburban Phoenix, working with students ranging from 4-year-olds taking their first music lessons to teenagers preparing for college auditions and scholarship competitions. Parents trusted her not only with their children's musical education, but with their emotional development during the challenging years when confidence and self-esteem were still forming through positive experiences with creative expression. Margaret's teaching philosophy was built around creating a safe, supportive environment where children could explore music without fear of judgment or criticism. Every student progressed at their own pace, celebrated small victories, and learned that mistakes were simply opportunities to improve rather than reasons for shame or disappointment. The studio was designed to feel more like a comfortable living room than a formal classroom, with soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and an atmosphere that encouraged creativity rather than performance anxiety. The weekly piano lessons provided structure and routine that many families relied on for stability during busy school schedules filled with academic pressure and extracurricular activities. Margaret's studio was often the calm center of a child's week, 45 minutes of focused attention, gentle guidance, and positive encouragement from an adult who was genuinely invested in their success and happiness. Parents frequently commented that their children looked forward to piano lessons more than any other weekly activity, often asking throughout the week when it would be time to visit Miss Margaret again. The students themselves would arrive excited to share what they'd practiced, eager to learn new pieces, and confident that they would receive patient support rather than criticism if they struggled with difficult passages. Margaret's approach to teaching went beyond technical instruction to include emotional support, confidence building, and the kind of mentoring that helped children develop resilience and self-worth that extended far beyond musical achievement. Many of her former students continued playing piano throughout their lives, but more importantly, they carried forward the confidence and problem-solving skills they developed during their years of musical training. But Margaret Chen wasn't just a piano teacher. She was former Child Protective Services investigator Margaret Chen, with 18 years of experience identifying and investigating cases of child abuse, neglect, and endangerment that had made her one of Arizona's leading experts in recognizing behavioral indicators that suggested children were experiencing trauma in their home environments. Margaret's career in child protection had focused specifically on cases involving young children who were too young to verbally report abuse, requiring her to develop expertise in reading behavioral signals, physical evidence, and environmental clues that indicated children were living in dangerous or harmful situations that required immediate intervention by social services and law enforcement agencies. During her CPS years, Margaret had investigated thousands of reports involving suspected child abuse, interviewed hundreds of children who had experienced trauma, and worked with law enforcement to build cases against adults who had harmed children in ways that would affect their victims throughout their lives. Margaret's specialized training included advanced coursework in child psychology, trauma recognition, interview techniques for young children, and the legal procedures required to remove children from dangerous situations while building evidence for criminal prosecutions that would protect them from further harm. Margaret's career in child protection had ended with voluntary resignation following a case involving a 6-year-old child who had died while under CPS supervision, despite Margaret's repeated recommendations for immediate removal from an abusive household where both parents had extensive criminal histories and documented substance abuse problems. The bureaucratic failures that had prevented Margaret from saving that child's life had convinced her that the system she devoted her career to protecting children was sometimes too slow, too complicated, and too focused on legal procedures rather than immediate safety concerns that couldn't wait for court hearings and administrative reviews. The child's death had occurred during a weekend when Margaret's emergency removal recommendations were pending review by supervisors who weren't available until Monday morning. By Sunday evening, emergency medical services were responding to a 911 call from neighbors who reported hearing sounds of violence from the apartment where Margaret had documented evidence of escalating abuse patterns that indicated imminent danger to the child's safety. The tragedy had destroyed Margaret's faith in institutional child protection and convinced her that individual action by trained professionals might be more effective than bureaucratic systems that prioritized legal compliance over immediate intervention when children's lives were in danger. The transition from investigating child abuse to teaching piano had been perfect therapy for someone who'd spent 18 years witnessing the worst that adults could do to innocent children. Instead of documenting trauma and building legal cases against abusive parents, Margaret was helping children develop confidence, creativity, and joy through music that would enrich their lives regardless of whatever challenges they might face in their home or school environments. Piano instruction allowed Margaret to work with children in positive, supportive contexts rather than the crisis situations that had defined her CPS career. Instead of interviewing children about traumatic experiences, she was helping them discover their musical abilities and develop skills that would provide lifelong sources of satisfaction and achievement. For 12 years, Margaret had deliberately avoided analyzing her students' behavior for signs of abuse or neglect that would have been crucial evidence during her CPS career. She developed professional blindness to the warning signals that might indicate children were experiencing trauma, focusing exclusively on musical instruction rather than the social work that had once consumed her professional life. Margaret had trained herself to see only musical potential, practice habits, and performance anxiety, the normal challenges that belong to piano instruction rather than the behavioral indicators that might suggest children were experiencing violence, neglect, or other forms of trauma that required immediate adult intervention. Her studio interactions were designed to be purely educational and supportive, avoiding the kind of personal questions or behavioral assessments that might remind her of the investigative work she'd left behind. Margaret's relationship with her students was built around music, creativity, and positive encouragement rather than the protective scrutiny that had been necessary during her child protection career. The peaceful routine of weekly piano lessons had provided exactly the kind of healing that Margaret needed after 2 decades of confronting human cruelty and institutional failure. Teaching music to happy, healthy children had allowed her to remember why she'd originally chosen to work with children, to help them develop their potential and experience the joy of learning new skills in supportive environments. But this Tuesday afternoon was different. This Tuesday afternoon, 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez arrived for her weekly piano lesson displaying behavioral changes that triggered every protective instinct that had been trained into Margaret during 18 years of child protection work. Emma had been taking piano lessons for 8 months, progressing steadily through beginner pieces while displaying the kind of enthusiasm and natural musical ability that made teaching a joy. She was typically eager, talkative, and excited to share what she'd practiced during the week between lessons, often arriving early and asking if she could start playing immediately. Emma's usual behavior included chattering about school friends, family activities, and pieces she wanted to learn, combined with the kind of innocent curiosity about music and instruments that belonged to children who were experiencing normal, healthy development in supportive family environments. But today Emma was withdrawn, nervous, and wearing a long-sleeved shirt despite the 90-degree Phoenix weather that had prompted most of Margaret's students to arrive in summer clothes appropriate for the season. Emma's usual enthusiasm was replaced by anxiety that seemed unrelated to musical performance or lesson content. When Margaret asked about Emma's practice routine during the week, her responses were hesitant and fearful, as if she was worried about giving wrong answers that might result in consequences that had nothing to do with piano instruction. Emma's typical confidence had been replaced by hypervigilance that belonged to children who were living under constant threat of unpredictable adult reactions. Most concerning, Emma flinched visibly when Margaret's phone rang unexpectedly during the lesson, displaying the kind of exaggerated startle response that indicated chronic exposure to environments where sudden sounds might signal imminent danger from adults who used violence to control children's behavior. Margaret realized that her peaceful piano studio was about to become the setting for a child protection case that would force her to choose between the quiet musical career she'd built and returning to the world of child advocacy that she tried to leave behind permanently. Margaret continued the piano lesson while her trained instincts automatically cataloged additional behavioral indicators that confirmed her growing suspicions about Emma's home environment. The child who had previously approached the piano with confidence and excitement was now hesitant to touch the keys, as if she was afraid that making mistakes might result in consequences that had nothing to do with musical instruction. Emma's physical positioning had changed dramatically from previous lessons. Instead of sitting naturally on the piano bench with relaxed posture, she was perched on the edge as if prepared to flee quickly if necessary. Her attention was divided between the piano lesson and constant monitoring of sounds from other parts of the house, displaying the hypervigilance that belonged to children who lived in environments where adult behavior was unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Most significantly, Emma kept tugging at her long sleeves to ensure they covered her wrists and arms completely, behavior that indicated she was deliberately concealing physical evidence that she understood adults wouldn't want other adults to see. When Margaret gently suggested that Emma might be more comfortable removing her sweater due to the warm weather, the child's panicked refusal confirmed Margaret's suspicions about what the clothing was hiding. Margaret had seen these exact behavioral patterns hundreds of times during her CPS career. Children who were experiencing ongoing abuse developed specific survival strategies that included concealing evidence, monitoring adult moods, and maintaining constant readiness to escape or defend themselves against unpredictable violence. Emma's musical performance during the lesson provided additional concerning evidence. Previously, she had played with natural rhythm and expression that indicated she felt safe enough to lose herself in the music. Today, her playing was mechanical and emotionless, as if she was afraid that displaying joy or creativity might attract unwanted attention from adults who saw children's happiness as problematic rather than valuable. When Margaret asked Emma to play a piece she had mastered weeks earlier, the child struggled with passages that had previously been effortless, suggesting that her ability to concentrate and retain information was being affected by trauma that was interfering with normal cognitive development. Margaret realized she needed to gather additional information without alerting Emma to the fact that she was conducting an assessment rather than providing music instruction. Her CPS training had taught her how to engage children in conversations that would reveal important details about their home environments without creating additional fear or confusion. "Emma, how has practicing been going at home this week?" Margaret asked while maintaining focus on the piano lesson to avoid creating anxiety about being questioned. "I couldn't practice much," Emma replied quietly. "Daddy gets angry when I make noise." The response confirmed Margaret's suspicions while providing crucial information about the dynamics in Emma's home. Children who were afraid to practice piano because of adult reactions were typically living with adults who used intimidation and threats to control normal childhood activities. Margaret continued gathering information through seemingly casual conversation while Emma played simple exercises that didn't require intense concentration. "Does Daddy get angry about other things too?" Emma nodded without looking up from the piano keys. "He gets angry when Mommy talks too loud, or when I ask for things, or when the TV is too loud, or when I drop things." The pattern Emma described was classic domestic violence escalation, where abusive adults gradually expanded their control over family members by creating an atmosphere of constant fear about unpredictable and increasingly violent reactions to normal family activities. Margaret understood that she was gathering evidence of a dangerous family situation that required immediate intervention, but she also knew that her approach would determine whether Emma received the protection she needed or whether the family would be alerted to outside scrutiny and potentially escalate their abuse to prevent discovery. "Emma, has Daddy ever hurt you or Mommy when he gets angry?" Margaret asked gently while continuing to provide piano instruction that would maintain the appearance of a normal lesson. Emma's silence lasted almost 30 seconds before she whispered, "He says it's not hurting if we deserve it." Margaret felt the familiar cold anger that had driven her CPS career, the fury that belonged to adults who understood that children like Emma were experiencing violence that would affect them for the rest of their lives while being told that they were responsible for adult behavior they couldn't control or predict. Emma's response indicated that she was being subjected to psychological manipulation designed to prevent her from seeking help or reporting abuse to adults who might intervene. The combination of physical violence and emotional manipulation suggested a family environment that posed immediate danger to both Emma and her mother. Margaret faced a decision that would determine whether Emma received immediate protection or continued experiencing escalating abuse that could result in permanent injury or death. She could contact CPS through official channels and hope that bureaucratic procedures would provide intervention before the situation deteriorated further, or she could take direct action based on her training and experience with cases where children's safety couldn't wait for institutional responses. Margaret made a decision that would save Emma's life while potentially ending her own peaceful retirement from child protection work. Instead of following institutional procedures that might take days or weeks to provide intervention, Margaret would use her training and experience to ensure Emma's immediate safety while building a case that would protect both Emma and her mother from further violence. Emma, I want you to know that some adults hurt children and other adults, but that's never the children's fault, and there are people who can help keep you safe, Margaret said while maintaining the piano lesson format to avoid creating additional anxiety. Emma looked up from the piano keys with the kind of desperate hope that belonged to children who had been waiting for someone to notice their suffering and offer help that they couldn't seek for themselves. "Can you help me?" Emma whispered. "Yes, I can help you," Margaret replied. "But I need you to be very brave and help me understand exactly what's been happening at home so I can make sure you and Mommy are safe." Over the next 20 minutes, while continuing to provide piano instruction that would appear normal to anyone who might be monitoring the lesson, Margaret conducted a child abuse interview that revealed the scope of violence that Emma and her mother were experiencing from Emma's father, who had been escalating his abusive behavior over the past several months. Emma's father had been unemployed for 6 months and had begun drinking heavily while becoming increasingly violent toward both Emma and her mother. The abuse included physical violence that had left both victims with injuries they were hiding from neighbors, teachers, and other adults who might report the situation to authorities. Emma's mother had been attempting to protect her daughter by absorbing most of the violence herself, but Emma's father had recently begun targeting the child directly when her mother wasn't available or when he wanted to punish his wife by hurting their daughter. The escalation pattern that Emma described was exactly the kind of dangerous progression that Margaret had learned to recognize during her CPS career: domestic violence that was becoming more frequent, more severe, and more likely to result in permanent injury or death if immediate intervention wasn't provided. Emma revealed that her mother had been researching domestic violence shelters and legal protection options, but was afraid to leave because Emma's father had threatened to kill both of them if they tried to escape or seek help from law enforcement or social services. Margaret understood that she was dealing with a highly lethality domestic violence situation where traditional intervention methods might actually increase the danger to both victims by alerting the abuser to outside awareness of his crimes. Margaret activated protocols she hadn't used since her CPS retirement, contacting specialized domestic violence units and child protection teams that were trained to handle emergency extractions from dangerous family situations. Her credentials and experience provided immediate access to resources that could ensure Emma and her mother's safety while building criminal cases against abusive adults. Detective Williams, this is Margaret Chen, former CPS investigator. I have a high lethality domestic violence situation involving a 7-year-old child and her mother. Immediate extraction required before situation escalates to potential homicide. The response was immediate. Margaret, we remember your work. What's the situation and what resources do you need? Margaret provided detailed intelligence about Emma's family situation, her father's escalation patterns, and the evidence of ongoing abuse that she had documented during her interview with Emma. Her professional assessment indicated that both victims were in immediate danger that required emergency intervention rather than traditional investigation procedures. We can coordinate immediate safe house placement and emergency protection orders, but we'll need the mother's cooperation and evidence that will support criminal charges, Detective Williams confirmed. Margaret understood that the next several hours would determine whether Emma and her mother escaped their dangerous situation safely, or whether the intervention would trigger violent retaliation from an abuser who had already demonstrated willingness to harm both victims. Margaret continued Emma's piano lesson while coordinating with law enforcement and domestic violence specialists who were preparing emergency intervention procedures that would extract both victims from their home environment while ensuring that Emma's father couldn't locate them or retaliate against them for seeking help. 2 hours later, while Emma's father was at a local bar where he spent most evenings drinking, specialized domestic violence teams executed a carefully coordinated extraction that removed Emma and her mother from their home environment and transported them to a secure facility where they could receive medical attention, counseling services, and legal protection from further violence. Margaret's interview with Emma had provided crucial evidence for criminal charges including child abuse, domestic violence, and terrorist threats that would result in Emma's father being arrested when he returned home to discover that his victims had escaped with help from law enforcement agencies that now possessed detailed evidence of his crimes. Emma's mother expressed gratitude not only for the immediate rescue, but for the professional expertise that had recognized the danger signals and responded with exactly the kind of intervention that she had been hoping to find but hadn't known how to access safely. The evidence that Margaret had gathered during Emma's piano lesson became the foundation for criminal prosecutions that resulted in Emma's father receiving a 15-year prison sentence for child abuse, domestic violence, and criminal threats. Emma and her mother were able to rebuild their lives with support from victim services and protective programs that ensured their safety while the legal proceedings unfolded. 3 months later, Emma resumed piano lessons with Margaret, but in a completely different context. Instead of using music instruction to hide her fear and trauma, Emma was now able to experience the joy and creativity that music was supposed to provide for children who felt safe and supported in their daily lives. Emma's musical progress accelerated dramatically once she was living in an environment where making mistakes didn't result in violence, where practicing piano was encouraged rather than forbidden, and where her natural enthusiasm and creativity could flourish without fear of unpredictable adult reactions. Margaret realized that her 12-year retirement from child protection work had been preparation for this moment. The opportunity to use her expertise in an environment where she could provide immediate help rather than navigating bureaucratic systems that might delay intervention until it was too late. 6 months after Emma's rescue, Margaret received a request from the Phoenix Police Department to train other music teachers, sports coaches, and community volunteers to recognize signs of child abuse and coordinate with law enforcement when children needed immediate protection. Margaret accepted the position, understanding that her experience demonstrated how civilian professionals could serve as early warning systems for children who were experiencing trauma that traditional systems might not detect quickly enough to prevent serious harm. Margaret's music studio became the training center for a community protection program that taught adults who worked with children to recognize behavioral indicators of abuse while coordinating with specialized law enforcement teams that could provide immediate intervention when children's safety was at risk. The program that began with Emma's piano lesson expanded to include teachers, coaches, religious leaders, and other community members who had regular contact with children and could be trained to identify situations where professional intervention was needed to protect young victims from ongoing trauma. Emma continued taking piano lessons throughout her recovery, but she also became an advocate for other children who were experiencing abuse. Her story provided hope for other young victims who learned that adults were willing to take action to protect them when they were brave enough to ask for help. Margaret's transition from child protection investigator to piano teacher had come full circle, but with a deeper understanding that protecting children wasn't just a professional responsibility. It was a community obligation that required every adult to be prepared to recognize danger signals and take action when children needed help. 12 years after leaving CPS work, Margaret had discovered that her most important case would come to her through music lessons rather than official reports, and that her expertise could save lives when applied by someone who was willing to act immediately rather than waiting for institutional procedures to provide protection that might come too late. Emma's rescue demonstrated that child protection happened most effectively when trained professionals were embedded in community settings where children felt safe enough to reveal their situations to adults who could recognize the significance of what they were hearing and respond with appropriate expertise. So now I ask you, have you ever noticed concerning signs in a child's behavior? Have you met someone whose professional background prepared them to protect children in unexpected situations? Share their story in the comments, because quiet guardians like Margaret deserve to be remembered. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Silent Heroes. We're here to honor the people who understand that protecting children is everyone's responsibility, and that real heroism happens when someone chooses to act when a child needs help. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the person teaching your child music has spent years learning to recognize when children need protection. And sometimes that expertise saves lives that might otherwise be lost to violence that happens behind closed doors.